The carriage stopped at the foot of Harrogate, before the rain had finished with it, and Eleanor Vane sat inside it, with her gloved hands folded so tightly that the seams had begun to give. She was 3 days married to a man she had met at the altar, and she had been told, by everyone who claimed to know, that she would not survive the winter under his roof. The footman opened the door. Beyond him, the great gray house rose against a sky, the color of a drowned thing, its windows dark, its stones streaked black with wet. Somewhere above, a single light burned in a room she could not name. She had been sold to settle her father's debts, and the man who had bought her was called in every drawing-room from Bath to London, the cruelest lord in 3 counties. She had heard the word so many times in the weeks before the wedding that it had stopped meaning anything and started meaning only him. Cruel. It had been said across her aunt's tea table low, as though the saying of it were a kindness. It would be said again before she was done. Yet in that first moment, stepping down into the rain with her one good trunk behind her, Eleanor did not yet know that the man waiting in the hall had spent the whole of that afternoon making certain the fire in her chamber was lit early, so that the cold would be gone from the room before she ever reached it. She knew only the word. She carried it up the steps like a stone in her shoe. If you have ever been handed to a stranger and told to be grateful, stay with me. This is a story about how long it takes to learn what a man truly is, and how a house can lie the way a rumor lies, all surface and no truth beneath. Eleanor learned it slowly. So will you. Lord Marcus Harrow, Earl of Harrogate, was waiting in the hall when the doors opened, and he was exactly as tall and as still as the stories had promised. He did not step forward. He did not smile. He stood with his hands behind his back near the cold hearth of the entrance hall, a tall man of 32 in a dark coat, his black hair damp at the temples as though he too had been out in the weather, and he watched her come in with an expression she could only read as displeasure. His face was carved and quiet, the jaw set, the mouth unmoving. His eyes were a gray, so pale they seemed lit from behind. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he has been forced to accept, and Eleanor felt the last of her courage go cold in her chest. "You are wet," he said. His voice was low and level, without warmth. "Mrs. Fenwick will take you up." That was all. He turned and went, his boots loud on the stone, and left her standing in a puddle of her own making, with a housekeeper's hand at her elbow. Eleanor did not weep. She had promised herself she would not weep in this house. Not on the first night, not where anyone could carry the sight of it back to the world that had put her here. She followed the housekeeper up the wide, dark stair, and she did not know, because how could she, that behind the shut door of his study, the Earl of Harrogate stood with his back against the wood and his eyes closed, cursing himself for the coldness he had not meant and could not seem to unlearn. Her room, when she reached it, was warm. She noticed it before she noticed anything else, before the good bed and the clean linen and the small writing desk under the window. The fire had been lit long enough to drive the chill from the corners. A cover had been turned down. On the table beside the bed, someone had set a plate of bread and cold meat, and a pot of tea still faintly steaming beneath its cloth, as though whoever had left it had timed the leaving to the hour of her arrival. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at the warmth of the room, and she told herself it meant nothing. A servant's habit. A house that ran on order regardless of who lived in it. She was too tired and too frightened to let it mean anything more. Mrs. Fenwick, a broad, calm woman with gray hair scraped back under a plain cap, set down the candle and turned to go. At the door, she paused. "His lordship gave orders about the fire," she said, and something in the way she said it, careful, weighted, made Eleanor look up. The housekeeper only nodded once and went out, and the door closed, and Eleanor was alone in a warm room in a cold house, married to a stranger. The whole world called cruel. She had been the eldest of 3 daughters, and after her mother died she had been the one who kept the household books, who knew to the shilling how far her father's fortune had fallen, and how fast. She had learned to read a ledger the way other girls learned to read a fan. So she understood, better than her younger sisters ever would, exactly what her marriage was and what it had bought. Her father's debts had grown teeth. There had been a note, and then a second note, and then a man in a good coat at the door of their leased house in town, speaking softly about ruin, and then from nowhere an offer. The Earl of Harrogate would settle everything. In exchange, he would have the eldest Vane daughter to wife, and no one need ever speak again of the £7,000 that stood between the family and the street. £7,000. She had written the figure herself, in her own hand, in the last entry of the book before she closed it forever. It was the price. Of her she did not resent it. Resentment was a luxury for women with choices, and she had understood since her mother's death that she had none. What she resented, if she resented anything, was the word that came attached to the bargain. Cruel. She had asked her aunt once, plainly, what he had done to earn it. Her aunt had looked away and said that some things a girl was better not knowing, and that had frightened Eleanor more than any plain answer could have. The first week at Harrogate passed in a silence so complete, it had a texture like dust. She saw her husband at dinner and nowhere else. They sat at opposite ends of a table built for 30. Two small figures in a cavern of candlelight and dark paneling. And they did not speak, and the footmen carried dishes the length of the room between them as though ferrying messages neither would send. He asked each night whether she had everything she required. She answered each night that she had. Then he would rise, bow with a stiff, precise courtesy that never reached his eyes, and go. She began to dread the sound of his chair pushing back. It meant the end of the only human company her day contained, however cold that company was. The days between the dinners were longer than any days she had known. Harrogate was a house designed to swallow a single person whole. She walked its corridors in the gray light of the short winter mornings, and met no one but the occasional maid, who dropped a curtsy and hurried on as though caught at something. The rooms went on, shut and shrouded, the furniture under Holland covers like a country of sleeping ghosts, and Eleanor understood that most of the great house had not been opened in years, that its master lived in 3 rooms and left the rest to the dust and the cold. She took to sitting in the morning room with the household accounts, which Mrs. Cimber. Fenwick had surrendered to her on the 4th day with visible relief, and she found in the columns of figures a strange comfort, the only occupation in that whole silent place that used the part of her that had once been useful. The books were honest, the house was solvent. Whatever the Earl of Harrogate was, he was not a spendthrift, and he was not a fool, and his servants were paid on the day, and not a day later, which was more than she could have said of her own father. She learned the shape of him from the accounts before she learned it from the man. She saw the sums set aside quarterly for a physician in the village, though no one in the house was ill. She saw the standing order to the bookseller in Bath, an account kept open for years. She saw tucked among the ordinary expenses of a great estate, a small regular payment to a woman named in the ledger only as nurse, and could not think what it meant, and set it aside, and did not forget it. A house tells its truth in its account books if you know how to read them, and Eleanor knew how to read them better than she knew how to do anything else in the world. The books were telling her something the dinners would not. She did not yet know how to hear it, and yet there were the other things, the small things, the things she could not fit into the word she had been given. The fire in her room lit early every evening without her ever asking. A shawl of soft gray wool that appeared over the back of her chair on the 3rd morning, when she had said nothing of being cold, though she had been cold, terribly, in the long stone corridors. A book left on the writing desk, a volume of poems she had mentioned once and only once at dinner, in a single sentence he had seemed not to hear. She turned the book over in her hands and could not make it agree with the man at the far end of the table. Someone in this house was gentle with her. She simply could not believe it was him. The kitchen decided otherwise. It was in the 2nd week that Eleanor, unable to sleep, went down the back stair in search of milk and found the cook and 2 maids at the great scrubbed table, talking low over the banked fire. They did not hear her on the stair. And so she heard, before they knew she was there, the cook say the word, the same word, in a tone of flat certainty, cruel, as his father before him, the cook said, wiping her hands. You mark it. She'll learn what the last one learned. One of the maids made a small frightened sound, and Eleanor, on the dark stair, pressed her hand to the cold wall, and felt the words settle into her, like a stone dropped into a well, down and down, until she could no longer hear it strike the bottom. The last one, she went back up without her milk. There had been a last one, of course there had. But a man of 32 did not come unmarried to the altar without a history, and no one at Harrogate had spoken a single word of it to her, which meant it was the kind of history that got wrapped in silence and shut in a room. She lay awake until the gray came up in the window, and thought about the light she had seen burning on the first night, in the room she still could not name, and she was afraid. You have felt this, I think. The moment when a kindness and a horror sit side by side in the same house, and you cannot tell which one is the truth and which the mask. Eleanor lived in that moment for a fortnight. Then the child came, and everything she thought she knew began, very slowly, to come apart. She met the boy in the East Gallery on a wet gray afternoon, a small dark-haired child of perhaps 6 years, sitting alone on the cold floor beneath the tall windows, with a wooden horse held forgotten in his lap. He did not look up when she came in. He had the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safest, and Eleanor, who had raised 2 sisters through a mother's death, knew that stillness on sight, and felt her whole heart turn over. She crossed the gallery and lowered herself to the floor beside him, careless of her gown, and said nothing at all. After a long while the boy leaned, by half an inch, against her arm. His name was Thomas. He was the Earl's son, and no one had told her the Earl had a son. She learned it from the boy himself in pieces, over the slow gray hour they sat together on the gallery floor. She had not meant to stay so long. She had meant to sit a moment, to let the child grow used to her, and then to go and find someone and demand to know why a boy of 6 was left alone on a cold floor in an unheated wing of the house. Yet she had raised 2 sisters, and she knew that a wary child will not be hurried, that the whole of the work is in the waiting, and so she waited, and asked him nothing. And after a while the questions came from him instead. He wanted to know if she lived in the house now. She said she did. He wanted to know if she was going to go away again, the way people did. Something in the small, flat way he said it, the way of people, stopped her breath in her throat, and she said carefully that, no, she did not think she was going away. He considered this. Then he told her that his mother had gone away. His mother was gone. He said it plainly, the way children say the largest things. And then he showed her how the wooden horse could stand on 3 legs if you balanced it just so. The nurse came for him at dusk, an elderly woman with kind, tired eyes, and stopped short in the gallery doorway at the sight of the new countess sitting on the floor with the boy against her arm. It was the nurse from the ledger. Eleanor understood at once the small regular payment among the ordinary expenses, and here was what it had meant all along. The woman began to apologize, to gather the child, to explain that his lordship did not like Master Thomas to be a trouble to anyone. Eleanor stopped her with a look and a word. The boy was no trouble. The boy would never again be a trouble to her as long as she drew breath in that house. She said it more fiercely than she had meant to, and the old nurse's tired eyes filled, and she said low, so the child would not hear, that it was a mercy someone had come at last who would sit with him, for his father loved him past all speaking and could not come within 10 feet of the boy's grief without turning to stone, and it was breaking them both, and had been for 3 long years. Then she took Thomas up to his supper, and Eleanor sat alone on the cold gallery floor a long while in the failing light, and began, for the first time, to be truly angry at the word she had been given, and at herself for how easily she had carried it. Eleanor's hands were steady while he showed her. Inside, she was reeling. A dead wife, a motherless child hidden away in the east wing of a house that ran on silence, and a father who, whatever else he was, had said not one word of either to the woman he had married, She thought of the word again. Cruel. It would not fit the boy, leaning warm against her arm. It would not fit the fire lit early in her room. It would not, she was beginning to understand, fit anything she had actually seen with her own 2 eyes, only the things she had been told. She began to visit the gallery every afternoon. Thomas expected her within the week. He was a grave, watchful child, quick under the wariness, and starved, she saw, for the plainest kind of attention, the kind that asks nothing and simply stays. She read to him from the book of poems that had appeared on her desk. She taught him a game with pebbles her mother had taught her. And one afternoon, looking up from the pebbles, she found the Earl of Harrogate standing in the gallery doorway, absolutely still, watching them. And on his carved, cold face was an expression she had never seen there, and could not name. It was gone before she could fix it. He inclined his head, said her name, said the boy's name, and withdrew. That night at dinner, at the far end of the long table, he asked her a question. That was not about whether she had everything she required. You sat with him, he said. The words came slow, as though he were unused to the shape of them. On the floor. He was alone, Eleanor said. The Earl was quiet for a moment. The candle stood between them, a long avenue of small flames. Yes, he said at last, very low. He is often alone. I have not known how to mend it. And then, as if the admission had cost him more than he could afford, he rose, bowed, and left her at the table with the sentence hanging in the air like smoke. Eleanor sat a long time after he had gone. She had heard it, plain as the pebbles in the boy's hand. Not cruelty, something else. Something that had no idea how to reach across a distance it had made itself. The word came at her a second time, 3 days later, and this time it came in daylight, in a fine drawing-room, spoken by a woman with diamonds at her throat. Lady Sybil Ashcombe had driven out from the neighboring estate to inspect, as she put it, the new countess, and she inspected Eleanor the way one inspects a horse of doubtful breeding. She was beautiful in the polished way of women who have never once been uncertain of their welcome. And she had, Eleanor gathered within the quarter hour, expected to be Countess of Harrogate herself. She sat very upright. She took her tea without looking at it, and she said with a smile as smooth as the cream she declined, "You are braver than they credit you, my dear, to live under such a roof. They do say he is the cruelest man in the county, and I have known him since we were children." I would not contradict them. The smile widened by a fraction. Do be careful. The last one was not. The last one was not careful. Eleanor set down her cup with great steadiness. She thanked Lady Sybil for the warning in a voice that did not shake, and she thought all the while of a small boy balancing a wooden horse on 3 legs, and of a man who had not known how to mend a child's loneliness, and had said so, as though confessing a crime. When the diamonds and the smooth smile had gone, rattling back down the drive, Eleanor stood a long time at the window. She was beginning to be angry, not at the Earl, at the word and at all the well-dressed mouths that carried it, and at how easily she herself had believed it before she had been given a single reason. Winter deepened. The snow came and stayed, and the roads out of the valley closed, and Harrogate was shut up alone with itself for the darkest weeks of the year. The proximity of 2 people in a great empty house did what proximity does. Slowly, against both their intentions, they began without either quite deciding to speak. It started with the boy. Always the boy, safe ground, where a father and a stranger could meet. She began to bring word of Thomas to the dinner table, small things that he had learned, the pebble game that he had asked a question about the stars, and she watched the Earl take each small report the way a starving man takes bread he is too proud to ask for carefully, without seeming to. He never asked her to stop. Once he asked very low whether the boy had seemed happy, and when she said that he had, something moved across the carved face and was gone, and the Earl looked down at his plate for a long moment before he could speak again. Then it spread past the boy. She found the Earl in the library one evening and did not retreat, and he did not send her away, and they sat at opposite ends of a long room with a fire between them, and talked of nothing dangerous for the better part of an hour. It became a habit before either would have called it one. She would come at the same hour with her book, and he would already be there with his, and neither would remark on it, and the fire would burn down while they read in a silence that had stopped being the silence of the dinner table and become something else, something companionable, the silence of two people who have found they do not mind the same room. He would look up sometimes and she would feel it, the pale gray eyes on her across the firelight, and when she raised her own he would return to his page, unhurried, unashamed, as though looking at her were a thing he had decided he was allowed. He asked what she was reading. She told him. He said after a silence that his wife had never cared for books, and it was the first time he had named the dead woman aloud, and he looked when he had said it, as though he had walked into a room he had meant to keep locked. Eleanor did not press. She had learned, raising her sisters, that a shut door opens from the inside or not at all. She only said, gently, "You need not tell me anything you would rather keep." And the Earl of Harrowgate looked at her across the length of the library, his pale eyes steady in the firelight, and said, "That is precisely why I find I want to." He seemed to surprise himself with it. He rose shortly after, and bade her good night. He had left the door, though, of the room ajar behind him, just barely, and Eleanor understood that she had been given a key, and that she must not use it carelessly. He told her the whole of it, on a night in December, when the snow came. She had gone to the library, out of habit, and found him already there, and found, too, that he had been drinking, though not much, only enough to loosen the hinge of a door long rusted shut. He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the fire. His first wife, he said, had been chosen for him, as Eleanor had been chosen for him, but chosen badly by a father whose only measure of a match was land. She had been unhappy at Harrowgate from the first. She had found the house cold, and the county dull, and her husband, he said, with a terrible flatness, colder and duller than either. He had not known how to reach her. He had tried in the only ways he knew, which were the ways his own father had taught him, which were no ways at all. He had given her a warm room and a good horse and his silence, and she had wanted, he understood far too late to be spoken to, and he had not known how. She had died of a fever 3 winters past, with the boy not yet 3, and in her last days she had turned her face to the wall when he came in. That was the thing he could not put down. Not her death. The turning of her face. He had stood at her bedside a stranger to her, and she had died believing herself unloved, in a house full of a love its master had never once learned to say aloud. "They call me cruel," the Earl said to the fire, very low, "and they are not wrong to. I was cruel to her. Not with my hands, with my silence. A man can starve a woman without ever raising his voice." He was quiet. The snow came down past the black windows. I swore I would not do it again. And then my father's habits took me, and I did it to you, from the first hour, at the door in the rain. I saw you were frightened, and I could not make my mouth say a kind word. I never can. When it matters most. Eleanor crossed the room. She had not decided to. Her body had decided for her, the way it had been deciding things about this man for weeks now ahead of her thoughts, against her caution. She stood before his chair and looked down at the bent dark head of the cruelest lord in 3 counties, and she was not afraid of him, had not been afraid of him for some time, and understood all at once that she had stopped being afraid without ever noticing the moment it happened. "You lit the fire in my room," she said, "before I ever asked, every night since I came." He looked up at her. "You are not silent," Eleanor said. "You only speak in a language no one taught the rest of them to hear." For a long moment the Earl of Harrowgate did not move. Then he lifted his hand. Slowly, as a man lifts his hand toward something he is not certain he is permitted to touch, and he did not quite touch her. His fingers stopped a breath from her wrist, close enough that she felt the warmth of them along the fine skin there. And he held them so, not touching, while the fire cracked and the snow came down, and Eleanor did not step back. She could hear her own heart. She was certain he could hear it too. Neither of them closed the last small distance. It hung between them, that distance more charged unclosed than it could ever have been closed, and when at last he let his hand fall, he did it gently, the way one sets down something that has become precious and fragile in the space of a single evening. "Go up," he said, and his voice was not level now, not cold, roughened at the edges in a way she had never heard. "Go up, Eleanor, before I forget every promise I have made myself about how a frightened woman ought to be treated in this house." It was the first time he had used her name. She carried it up the stairs the way she had once carried the word, but it weighed nothing at all, and it warmed her the whole way to her door. After the night of the snow, everything and nothing changed. They did not speak of what had passed in a library, or nearly passed, and yet it was present at every meal, in every silence, a third thing at the long table that had not been there before. He began to sit nearer. He moved one evening, without comment, from the far end of the table to the chair at her right hand, and the footmen's faces did not change, but something in the house did, some long-held breath let slowly out. Thomas noticed first, as children do. The boy began to bring his wooden horse to dinner and set it between them, a small wooden ambassador and the Earl. To Eleanor's astonishment, took to mending its loose leg at the table with a bit of glue and a patience she had not known he owned. She fell in love with him. Watching him mend the horse, she could name the moment exactly. His large, careful hands around the small broken toy, the frown of concentration, the way he tested the mended joint twice before he gave it back, the way the boy's face opened when it held. This was the cruelest man in 3 counties. Eleanor sat at the dinner table with her heart entirely undone, and understood that she wanted this man, wanted him with a wanting that had nothing to do with the £7,000 or the safety of her sisters or any bargain struck by anyone. Wanted him for the frown over the broken horse and the fire lit early, the language no one else had learned to hear. She had come to Harrogate braced to endure a cruel stranger. She had not braced for this, and there was no bracing for it. And she did not want to be braced. The world that had made the word, however, did not intend to let it go so easily. Lady Sybil had not driven away for good. She had driven away to gather herself, and she came back with an audience. The Harrogate Assembly Ball was an old obligation, held every year in the long gallery of the great house, and it could not be avoided in the first winter of a new countess, without a scandal worse than the one it might cause. So the county came in its carriages and its diamonds to inspect the woman the cruelest lord had bought, and Eleanor received them at her husband's side, in a gown of soft gray, and told herself she could survive one night of being looked at. She had survived worse. She had survived the drive up in the rain. She stood in the candlelight of the long gallery where she had first sat on the floor with a lonely child, and she smiled, and she endured. Lady Sybil chose her moment with the care of a woman who had rehearsed it. She waited until the room was full and the music paused between dances until the natural hush had fallen that makes every word carry, and then she said, in a voice pitched precisely to reach the walls, "How well you look, my dear. Considering. Tenoring. We were all so certain you would not last the winter, and yet perhaps he has been gentler with you than he was with the last. One does hope he has learned. A man does not earn a name like his for nothing, after all. Cruel, they call him. And they have known him longer than you. There it was, the third time, and the cruelest because it was public, and because it was aimed to wound not Eleanor, but the man beside her, to open in him the exact wound Eleanor now knew he carried, before the whole assembled county. The room went, still in the particular way a room goes, still when it sensed blood. Eleanor felt her husband go rigid at her side. She saw, without turning, the old silence begin to close over him, the silence that had killed a woman by inches and made a monster of a grieving man, and she understood in a single clear instant that if she waited for him to defend himself, he would not, could not. That his cruelty had only ever been the cruelty of a man who could not make his mouth say the true thing when the true thing mattered most. So Eleanor spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She had learned from him, without knowing she was learning, that the quietest voice in a still room is the one that carries furthest. She looked at Lady Sybil across the waiting gallery, and she said clearly, into the silence, "You mistake him, and you always have." That was all. 6 words. The room drew a single breath. And then the Earl of Harrogate, beside her, did the thing that no one in that gallery had ever seen him do, and that Eleanor would remember to the end of her life. He turned to her in front of all of them, and he took her hand, and he raised it to his lips, and he held it there a moment longer than any rule of propriety allowed, his pale eyes never leaving hers, so that not one soul in that crowded gallery could pretend to misunderstand what they were seeing. Then he lowered her hand, and kept it in his, and said, in his low, level voice made to carry 7 words that ended the county's long verdict on him forever, "My wife has the right of it." The gallery did not know what to do. For a heartbeat, it did nothing at all. Then, from somewhere near the musicians, an old woman began softly to applaud, and another took it up. And Eleanor saw that the room which had come to watch a cruel man's new wife wither had instead watched something it had not seen in that house in living memory, and it did not know whether it was permitted to be moved. Lady Sybil stood alone in the middle of the turning tide, with her diamonds and her rehearsed cruelty, and no audience left for either. She had not lost to spite. She had lost to a thing she had no defense against, which was the plain sight of a man in love, and she knew it, and her polished certainty cracked down the middle in front of everyone. And she made her excuses, and she was gone from Harrogate before the dancing resumed. The Earl did not let go of Eleanor's hand for the rest of the night. They did not speak of it until the house was quiet, and the last carriage had gone crunching down the drive and the candles in the long gallery had been snuffed to a few. He found her at the tall windows where she had once sat on the floor with his son. Outside the snow had begun again, falling slow and thick through the dark, and the gallery was warm behind them, and she heard him cross the floor and stop close at her back. "You defended me," he said, "before I could fail to defend myself." "Yes," Eleanor said, watching the snow. "No one has ever done that." His voice was very low. "In my whole life, no one has ever stood between me and that word. I did not know it could be done. I had come to believe it was simply true." She felt him draw a breath. "You made it not true. In 6 words in front of the county, you made it not true." She turned from the window then, and found him nearer than she had thought, near enough that she had to lift her face to his, and she saw that the carved cold mask was entirely gone, had perhaps never been anything but a mask, and that beneath it was a man looking at her, as though she were the first warm room he had entered in 3 winters. He lifted his hand again, as he had in the library. On the night of the first snow, this time he did not stop short. This time his fingers found her jaw light as the falling snow, and he tilted her face up, and he waited there a breath, giving her every chance in the world to step away. Eleanor did not step away. She had done all her stepping away in a lifetime that was over now. She closed the last small distance herself, and rose onto her toes, and kissed the cruelest lord in 3 counties softly, and fully, in the snow-lit dark of his own gallery, and felt his arms come around her at last, careful and sure, as though he had been learning this language too, all winter, in secret, and had only been waiting for someone to hear him speak it. They were married again in the spring, in a manner of speaking, though there was no second ceremony. It was only that the thing the first wedding had been meant to be, and had not managed, quietly came true between the thaw and the first green, without documents or witnesses or a single pound changing hands. Her sisters came to Harrogate for a long visit and found their eldest sister transformed, and went home unable to explain to their aunt what they had seen, only that the house the county called cold had been the warmest they had ever stayed in, and that the lord the county called cruel had spent a whole afternoon on the floor of the East Gallery teaching his son and his new sisters-in-law a game with pebbles that his wife's mother had once taught her. Thomas began to laugh. It came slowly, the way the fire had once driven the cold from the corners of her room, first in the safe places, and then everywhere, until the boy who had learned that stillness was safest forgot to be still at all. He took to calling Eleanor by a name she had not asked for and did not correct. The wooden horse, mended for good, now its loose legs sound, stood on the mantel of the room they all used in the evenings, retired from active service, an old soldier watching the family it had helped to make. On an evening late in that first spring, Eleanor sat with her husband by the fire in the small, warm room, the boy asleep against her side, the mended horse on the mantel, the last light going blue in the windows. She thought of the carriage, stopped at the foot of the house in the rain, and the words she had carried up the steps like a stone, and how certain the whole world had been, and how wrong. She had been sold to the cruelest lord in 3 counties. She had discovered over one long winter in a fire, lit early and a book left on a desk, and a hand that stopped a breath from her wrist, that the world had been reading him wrong her whole engagement, that his silence had never been cruelty but only grief that had lost the way to speech, and that the gentlest man she had ever known had been standing at the door in the rain that first night, unable to say a single kind word, aching to her husband, felt her looking and turned his head. The firelight moved on the face the county had called cold. "What is it?" he said low, the way he always said it now, and there was nothing in the world colder than firelight in it. "Nothing," Eleanor said. She looked at the sleeping boy and the mended horse and the man who had learned, over a single winter, to speak. "Only that I am home." He took her hand, the way he had taken it in the gallery before the whole county, and he raised it to his lips, and this time there was no one to see, and no verdict to overturn, only the fire and the falling dusk and the small sound of the boy breathing. Outside, the last of the winter snow had melted from the stones, and the first green had come to the country the world had called cold, and inside the house that the world had called cruelest, a fire burned early against a chill that was already gone. If Eleanor's winter moved you, stay a moment before you go, and think of the last time you took a hard word for a true one, and were wrong. The gentlest people are so often the quietest. Thank you for staying until the end.